Great. All right, everyone. So now we have our keynote talk by Dan Britt, and he's going to talk to us about the economics and exploration, a little historical perspective. Dan, thank you.
Well, thanks for sticking around. I'm quite amazed that I actually have an audience. So I appreciate it. This actually comes from my kind of dark period before becoming a planetary scientist. I have to confess I was an economist. And I have a master's in economics, and I actually worked in economics, and it was so boring that that's why I became a planetary scientist. But actually economics is very useful because fundamentally economics is a systematic way of looking at human history and also human interactions. It's and what I was particularly interested in was economic history. And where we are in planetary science is actually the start of a new era. And one of the ways I think we can get perspective on this new era is to look back at the last great age of exploration that really began with Columbus and continued for hundreds of years after that. And so there's a lot of analogs between the development of the Dutch Flute, that's that ship right there, and that ship right there, the SpaceX Falcon. And the details are kind of interesting. One of the details that always bothered me was in grade school, we learned that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And then the next thing you do in grade school is they turn around and say, well, Jamestown was founded in 1607. And it always bothered me, why did it take over 100 years for the English to get across the Atlantic when the Spanish were doing it all the time? Massachusetts settlement didn't begin until 1620. Why was that? That always bothered the hell out of me. You need to apply a few economic principles to this, and it all becomes clear. I learned my economic history from this guy, who nobody in this room knows, but Doug North won the Nobel Prize in 1993. And what he did was he systematically approached history from an economic perspective. And what it does is it makes clear a lot of societal drivers that otherwise seem puzzling. And for exploration, it goes down to three things: risk return, investors assess, actually on average fairly rationally, expected return, and discount that return by expected risks. You need to look at investment and entry costs. Are there barriers, either legal, physical, social, or whatever, to entry or high initial investments, or both? You need to think about opportunity cost. What can you do with that money rather than risk it doing something very strange and very risky? So what's your next best alternative? And you need to think about externalities. Externalities are unintended costs and consequences of your action. And one of the problems with externalities is quite often somebody bears the costs. And it's not always clear. In fact, it's often not clear at the start who's going to end up holding the bag. And during the great age of exploration, there were some significant externalities, which I will talk about. So let's start with Columbus. Risk return. The original investment was a grant coming off a research proposal. The proposal was highly speculative, but the potential for return was very high. In fact, I like Columbus because he got rejected. His research proposal got rejected twice by four times by two different funding agencies. I feel, brotherhood with him. The funding agency appears to have, for investment and entry costs, the funding agency accepted the proposal, but appears to have substantially cut the grant. Again, I feel brotherhood for him. What the Crown did was they dumped a lot of the supply costs on the coastal cities, and they also gave him small and very old ships. You need to look at opportunity cost. What was happening in the background was that Spain's long reconquest of the peninsula against the Muslim states had just finished. And so unemployment was high because they fired all the soldiers right after they took Granada. And also there was a funding peace dividend. That year the money available was actually pretty high. And so they were able to go down quite a ways in their ranked order of research proposals. Also, since you had high unemployment, you had low crewing and ship rental costs, because all those ships that had been hired to haul supplies and harass the Moors were now unemployed. And of course, you had no clue about externalities. Now, I looked at this, and I was able to find a copy of the old panel review for Christopher Columbus. What was amazing is that the forms have not changed in 500 years all that much. And the panels are still as snide as ever. So, brief summary. Proposal would develop a new route to the Indies by sailing west and avoiding conflict with Portugal and Turkish interests. Brief summary of the overall evaluation. While the goal is very attractive, the proposal has a number of major weaknesses. The proposer asserts that the Earth's circumference is substantially smaller than observational data has shown over the last 1900 years. This seems to be based on a simple errors in units. The realistic distances to be sailed put the proposed goals far beyond the effective range of shipping technology. The PI does not demonstrate the relevant navigation, scientific, and mission leadership experience required for success of the proposal. And it still got funded. Many discovery proposals should take heart from this. Anyway, I have a more detailed, there are the detailed major weaknesses. The problem with the circumference, data actually goes back to Eratosthenes and was confirmed by actual stellar observations by Poseidonus. Data was solid. Anyway, we don't need to belabor his weaknesses. But what was impressive was the small size of the ships that actually crossed the Atlantic. This was actually low-hanging expeditionary fruit. It was also clear signs of budget cuts. It seems that that's a snide thing to say about funding agencies. But anyway, the risk-return ratio, the returns were huge from a trivial investment. The Spanish very quickly encountered an organized and very wealthy set of civilizations. The silver they got from the Americas accounted for 1/5 of the Spanish Empire's budget for the next 200 years. That was the impact. What they did, of course, was they embarked on a completely wacky and overextended foreign policy, which blew all that money and disrupted Europe terribly. But the precious metals input tripled the world stock of precious metals. Atahualpa's ransom to Pizarro was 50 tons of silver. Can you imagine that? 50 tons of silver? What happened is that this kind of return set off a frenzy of investment and settlement. Literally 5% of the Spanish population decamped to the Americas. It also encouraged competition. So, random other pirates like Francis Drake. I keep wanting to call him Sir, but when he was a pirate, he wasn't a knight yet. He circumnavigated the globe again in this tiny little boat. He captured a Spanish galleon. That was the largest treasure captured to that date, 6 tons of gold and silver. Queen Elizabeth was an investor in this venture, and her share was enough to pay off her entire foreign debt. That's the kind of returns you have from a trivial investment in exploration. But you didn't know that at the time. You know that it was speculative, but the rewards could be high. But of course, he had 4 major weaknesses. I mean, how did they get by that? You look at shipping technology, and a big factor in this is transportation costs. And they had actually undergone a revolution in shipping technology the century before and developed the galleon. And this was pretty good technology for the time. Reduced wind resistance, very strongly built, fast, maneuverable, unprecedented level of stability, capable of very long voyages. After they captured Mexico and started silver production, what they did was they opened up a trans-Pacific trading system with China, where you would load silver in Acapulco and you'd sail 14,000 kilometers one way to Manila and trade for silks and porcelain. Wow, what technology. So the Manila galleons ran up to 2,000 tons, and they could carry 1,000 passengers. But fundamentally, this was a ship that was not very specialized. So it was really designed for defense and not so much for trading. So it was fine for the Spanish because they had small, high-value cargoes that people wanted to steal. They needed space for large crews because the phrase that historians use is fight the ship, because you have to have lots of swabos to pull on the lines and man the guns. And you also have to allow for wastage, because they didn't deal with this, they didn't actually puzzle out the scurvy problem until the end of the 18th century. So if you're going to sail 14,000 miles, you're not going to get much many fresh vegetables. You're going to have a vitamin C problem, and somewhere around a quarter to a third of your crew are going to die. And so you have to allow for what they called wastage in the old term. But that's okay, because the returns are very high. They're expensive to build, they're expensive to crew, they're expensive to maintain, but the returns made it worth it. But the returns have to be at a fairly high level. You're talking expensive luxury goods like silks, Chinese silks and porcelain, or gold and silver bullion. And that was the level of the trade. You also have to look at the unknown unknowns in risk and return. Now, remember that Columbus set off on the 3rd of August and returned the 15th of March. People who live along the Gulf Coast know that as hurricane season. Columbus didn't know that. And so during the age of sail, Columbus was very lucky. He didn't encounter a hurricane until his 3rd voyage. During the age of sail, an encounter with a hurricane is generally fatal. Quite often you're able to plot in the old days, you plot the progress of hurricanes by when ships don't arrive. So that's very bad. The fleets of the day, basically what they did was they evacuated the tropics after July and just stayed away from the tropics during hurricane season. This particular plot is the Florida Keys and the wreck of the 1733 Spanish treasure fleet. They were not so lucky. That was a July 15th hurricane. I just like to show this picture lest you think that it's because the Spanish galleons weren't very seaworthy. This is a replica of the HMS Bounty, so it had the advantage of 200 years more technology. This is the historic HMS Bounty in the eye of Hurricane Sandy. Luckily, the Coast Guard were able to rescue the crew. Anyway, it's just difficult if all you've got are sails to deal with hurricanes. And there were serious externalities. What was the population of the Americas in 1491? You read the early accounts, and I got interested in this and read a bunch of them. It's very interesting. Quotes from De Soto's expedition, and he went all over the South and along the Mississippi River and along what was later known as the Arkansas River, and a land thickly set with great towns. 2 or 3 towns can be seen from one. Each city protected itself with earthen walls, moats, and archers. America was thickly settled. When La Salle visited the same area in 1682, he did not see a single Native American for 200 miles. All those cities had disappeared. Much of North America was farmed and it was managed. The Native Americans used fire for forest management and forest clearing. And so you read the accounts of the early explorers, and they ran wagons and walked through open park-like forests in the American East and complained about the constant set fires during the summer. The Native Americans did this because they liked open forests, because they wanted to encourage elk and deer herds, and they also wanted to manage the forest for nut production. So they encouraged hickory, chestnut, oaks, things like that. In fact, the whole explosion of passenger pigeons occurred as a result of that. And that's just an aside, but I can talk about that if anybody's interested. So visitors to the New England coast in the 1500s, and there are a lot of them, reported these large villages with extensive fields of corn occupying every inlet. Attempts at settlement before the Mayflower essentially were thwarted because the coast was too crowded with aggressive and warlike natives. So people that landed, because the natives very quickly found out that Europeans are not the nicest people in the world, they would be attacked. Explorers to Virginia remarked on the smoky nature of the land from numerous fires set by the natives. When the Mayflower settlers actually arrived, the first winters, they survived by plundering the food caches of deserted villages, because an epidemic just before the Mayflower showed up killed 90% of the population. The first 50 Puritan settlements were located on Indian villages that had been emptied by disease. You can go to St. Louis, just across the Mississippi from St. Louis, and there's Cahota. It contains 120 human-built mounds that was surrounded by a 2-mile defensive stockade. The population in 1200 was 40,000. That was the largest city in North America for 600 years. Early explorers in the Amazon reported, again, numerous warlike peoples. Numerous and very large settlements, very pretty country, very fruitful land. You can see archaeological remnants of this, which people are just starting to uncover. And lots of pre-Columbian things like pre-Columbian terraces, pre-Columbian crop marks all over the place. The population in 1491 was about 120 million. That was about 20% of world population at the time. We have pretty good numbers for the very organized societies in central Mexico. And so when Cortez showed up in central Mexico, there were somewhere between 25 and 30 million people in central Mexico. Now, the population of Spain at that time was just 10 million. What happened was that in 100 years, that population had collapsed to 800,000. It wasn't until the 20th century that the population of Mexico recovered to its pre-Columbian levels. So what happened? Well, population collapse was due to disease. Europeans had been living a long time with domesticated livestock. You didn't have domesticated livestock in the Americas. And livestock's not just a food source, it's also, we share diseases through mutation. So avian flu becomes human flu. Bovine rinderpest is measles. Horsepox becomes smallpox. Pigs are especially nasty. They transmit anthrax, brucellosis, trichinosis, flu, and tuberculosis. Remember, I started talking about DeSoto wandering through the South United States. DeSoto was clever. He decided that he would take his supplies on the hoof, and he had this huge herd of pigs. It was probably this huge herd of pigs, a bunch of them escaped, went wild, that transmitted the diseases that essentially depopulated the southern United States. Millions of people. And Europe and Africa are full of diseases and parasitic critters that would thrive very well in American climates. They just were never there. So there was no malaria, no yellow fever before Columbus. So this is called the Colombian Exchange. We got tomatoes, corn, potatoes, pineapples, pumpkins, peppers, the Americas got sugarcane, honeybees, bananas, and smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. Also cattle and sheep and horses. And earthworms, yes. So when economists talk about externality, I'm sorry, I've heavied up on you, but this is a big externality. It also probably caused the little ice age. Because remember, what you're talking about is removing a fifth of the world's population. And this population was particularly prolific in burning forests and putting CO2 into the atmosphere. And you can actually see the drop in the CO2 level in the ice cores as associated with this collapse in population. So that's a lot to lay to Columbus's door. You know, but it's not his fault. It could have been that the Native Americans had learned to build sailing ships, popped on the prevailing westerlies, and gone over and visited North America, and then come back on the trade winds. And the result would have been the same. They didn't need to be conquered to suddenly find out that they were not adapted to the disease mix in Europe and Asia. But that's an externality. So what was happening in North America during the 1500s? It's not like the English were ignoring the Americas. They tried. Everybody's heard it. You know, in high school they force you to learn about John Cabot, who explored North America for some English merchants. It turns out that John Cabot is actually Italian. His name is Giovanni Cabito. The problem was he just didn't find very much except lumber and fishing grounds. So you look at this in terms of economics. Risk return. We found out that the shores of North America were thickly settled by hostile natives. So getting a foothold was very tough. Also, for investment entry, the Spanish claimed everything. And I say they were known to discourage other explorers. What they did was they had a tendency to either murder them or imprison them and confiscate their ships because they were trespassing. Also, this is Northern Europe was still recovering from the Black Death at this time. And so wages and shipping costs were fairly high. It doesn't mean that North America wasn't visited. Actually, there's some evidence to suggest that Columbus wasn't the first person, that the Basque fishermen had actually been visiting the Grand Banks for quite some time before Columbus. They just didn't want to publicize it because then other people would go to the Grand Banks and take their fish. But you had Grand Banks fishing, and the way they dealt with the hostile natives was they just found an uninhabited island to go salt their fish and dry them out. Worked just fine. Lumbering the same way. People would sail across the North Atlantic in the 1500s, find a nice isolated island, cut down the trees, load up, and sail back. What you really needed was the economic factors to change in order to allow continued exploration and development. What happened was that during the 1500s, you developed a thing called the Dutch Flute. Now, probably nobody in this room has ever heard of the Dutch Flute. But what it did was it drastically changed the transportation costs equation. It was cheaper to build, it carried twice the cargo per ton as a galleon, could be handled by a much smaller crew. It essentially took advantage of technology. Block and tackle was new technology in the 1500s, and used that extensively to facilitate ship operations. And this lowered transportation costs by a factor of 3 and revolutionized things. And so by the 1607, the equations had changed. By 1607, your problem with native clashes and Spanish interference was not so bad. The natives were dying off, thanks to the Spanish externality, and the Spanish had other problems. Your return was the production of staples. If you read the accounts of Jamestown, they started in 1607 and they actually didn't get viable until about the 1612, 1613, because they were going around acting like, well, like the Spanish explorers, looking for gold and silver and not finding anything. And then they realized they could grow tobacco, and tobacco was a huge cash crop. And so look at the explosive growth. In 15 years, you've gotten up to a 500,000 pounds export per year. Hugely profitable. Transportation costs have dropped by a factor of 3 over the last 100 years. Land, since you've recovered the population from the Black Death, is becoming more expensive, but it's very cheap, essentially free in America. And the population had also recovered, so real wages had been falling. Effective wages in Virginia were more than double that of England, even accounting for all the other issues. And so the major European export became people. Of course, externalities were still largely unknown and ignored. Plymouth, the same sort of thing. Revolution in transportation costs were such that you could make money shipping raw lumber and salted fish to Europe. And one attraction was local political power, and so religious fringe groups tended to move out there, like the Puritans. And so something like 20,000 Puritans came to New England. Not everybody liked it. Somewhere analyzing the shipping manifest, something like 7 to 11% returned to England. Again, land was cheap. Spanish were less of a threat. The natives were mostly dead. And for opportunity costs, wages and transport costs were low. And again, the major European export was people. So what developed was an integrated Atlantic economy based on the production of bulk agricultural staples. So you got sugar in the West Indies, lumber and fish in New England, tobacco, indigo, rice, and cotton in Virginia and the Carolinas. With low transportation costs, cheap land, few barriers to entry, and good legal protection, all this is made possible. There's some books I've been reading about this. I recommend them. They're very interesting. But fundamentally, this produced an economy that was integrated and growing. And you didn't have to exploit settled societies in order to make it work. So, a few historical thoughts. Transportation costs are key. They were key in the 1500s. It's the revolution in flute technology that made this the kind of exploration that we saw in North America possible. This may be a strong analogy to what's happening now. Institutional and legal frameworks are very important. Nothing turns off explorers faster than blurry property rights. Areas with perceived attractive returns get explored first. But you shouldn't undersell the advantages of cheap land, which is why it took a long time for people to get over the idea that you search for cities of gold. Externalities are very important and usually very poorly understood. Our history of inadvertently killing off 20% of the world's population is not very encouraging. This is kind of a downer in the talk, but most people just don't realize this, that the Americas were not this pristine wilderness. It was full of people, and most of them died before the bulk of the European settlement. And so the Europeans show up and think, wow, wilderness. Opportunity costs make a big difference. High unemployment and low wages do encourage risk-taking. It's true. So anyway, a little bit of economics, a little bit of history, and a little bit of insight as to where we are in the scheme of things. Thank you.
Comments? Discussion? David.
Wonderful. Perhaps I'm pushing a little more in time, but somewhere along there, the importation of cheap labor, namely slaves, became pretty critical too for agriculture in the New World, didn't it?
It did. Actually, a lot of the importation in the early days that I was covering were indentured slaves, where you essentially sold your freedom for 5 years for passage. But that's another whole kettle of fish. This was a half-hour talk. The hour talk, I can get into that. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ahmed Malik, Stony Brook University. So you identified 4 economic drivers in the beginning of your talk.
Yes.
How would you, based on those 4 things, how would you convince the American public and the world at large that space exploration can do something similar? How would you get that message across to them?
Well, I should make a slide like that, I suppose. I can't do it too well off the top of my head, but as I said, transportation costs are key. If you can drop transportation costs by major factors like the Dutch Flute dealt with. Also, risk return is an issue. The American public seems to think that space travel has no risk. And I hate to tell you the level of just painful carnage that was inflicted on the early explorers. You haven't heard of a lot of them because they died. So you have to recognize that this is not riskless or painless. You need to deal with property rights and a legal framework, and some people are thinking about that. But this is an economic analysis, and it's not a soundbite for Congress. And so you have to some extent, it's a way of organizing thinking, but it's not a way of selling this whole thing. Okay?
Pam Clark. So yeah, these thoughts, which are wonderful, and I agree. 1491 is absolutely revolutionary, and everybody should read it. I've been looking for 1493.
It's a good book.
Yeah, and it really completely puts to death all these myths about Native Americans, primitive, savages.
Well, actually,
it was a very carefully controlled environment. Yeah. But this begs the question about, what technologies could create low transportation costs? What kind of legal frameworks could we use to encourage investment? And so I would argue that I'm going to give some partial answers to these, but I'd like to stimulate discussion, because I think this is important to do. That 3D printing technology could potentially greatly reduce the logistics costs.
Yep.
And if you want to send humans, just take the raw material and surround the humans with the raw material. You're not transporting instruments anymore. You just have what you need to transport, and that could have a big impact. And that for legal framework, we ought to, in terms of property rights, we ought to think about strategies which Congress is not capable of doing, in my opinion, because they're a bunch of lawyers, unfortunately, that encourage investment. Anything that encourages investment, anything that encourages people to think, an incentive-based system. Incentive, not punitive like we have now. But when people make these investments and things that can pay huge dividends at the expense, cost of risk, they should be rewarded for that behavior, and they should have their tax burdens lowered, and they should get special perks for doing that. And those I would argue that these would be starting thoughts for the kinds of systems we might think about that would address those 2 issues.
Read Doug North's book. It's old, but it's good.
Okay. Erica Jowen, Brown University. Your presentation was really interesting, but what you basically did was outlined the emergence of colonialism, and I have some issues with trying to advertise the model of colonialism, which is basically a Eurocentric viewpoint, and using that as a model for future exploration from the US and from international partners. Could you maybe address that issue, and if you have any other model for how we could frame exploration not from a Eurocentric perspective?
It's a little bit difficult because, of course, that's the model we have historically. You don't have to do the same things. You just have to recognize that there are some driving forces within that colonial model. And actually, the colonial model didn't work so well in North America because one of the things that the British did was they never quite figured out what to do with North America. And when they started trying to do something with it, it wasn't until the late 18th century, and that resulted in a revolution. Basically what, at least in North America, Europeans were expanding into a vacuum. It was a vacuum that was created by the Colombian Exchange, but it was none of their own doing. And I would not advocate treating the Native Americans the way that we did, but that's something to keep in mind. As I said, the externalities were poorly thought out and fairly horrific, which is why I spent a fair amount of time on externalities. So I agree, we got to watch out for that.
Okay, one more comment?
Well, I wanted to say that Mars and many asteroids have all the basic resources. Somebody was saying we should bring the resources and use rapid 3D printers to supply the equipment we need, but we don't need to bring most of the basic resources. We need to bring the processing and manufacturing capacity to start really building up the infrastructure and whatever. There's incredible amount of energy, unbelievable amount. But our moon is missing very many critical resources to do an awful lot with.
So true. What you found during this age is that the people who were doing the settling and the exploring made extensive use of local resources. Sad to say, the reason Cortez was successful was that he was able to exploit local political divisions in Central America and in Central Mexico. And so he ended up having more Native Americans fighting on his side than were fighting against him. And the problem, of course, is that if you hang around Spanish too much, you end up with tuberculosis and smallpox and all the other things they brought with them. The Americas did get one back. We got syphilis.
And probably none of those will happen on an asteroid.
I hope not.
So that's the good news of this. But thank you so much, Dan. This is a very enlightening talk. Let's thank him very much.